Leakin Park, officially known as Gwynns Falls, Leakin Park is a vast urban forest in Baltimore, Maryland, encompassing over 1,200 acres. It stands as one of the largest contiguous woodland parks in any major U.S. city, offering a rich tapestry of natural beauty, historical landmarks, and community initiatives. Lincoln Park, which is now infamous in popular culture for darker associations, it has roots grounded in an early 20th century vision of urban preservation, ecological stewardship, elite philanthropy as well. Its inception was not incidental, but the result of progressive landscape planning, strategic municipal development, and the enduring legacy of a single influential family. So, to understand how this massive urban woodland came into being, one must retrace its lineage through the interplay of landscape architecture, civic planning, and historical land ownership during a transformative period in Baltimore's growth. So, the earliest seeds of what will become Leakin Park were sown at the dawn of the 20th century. So, in 1901, the city of Baltimore designated an area near the intersection of Edmondson and Hilton Avenues as the Gwynns Falls Reserve. And this area, it was located along Gwynns Falls, a 25-mile urban stream that had long played a central role in the ecological and economic life of Baltimore. And the initial goal of the reserve, it was simple yet visionary, and that was to preserve the natural contours and woodland ecology, ecology. My apologies, ecology of a critical watershed area from the pressures of urban sprawl and industrial development. Now, at the time, Baltimore was undergoing rapid expansion, and public officials they began to recognize the need for a conservationist urban planning. So, the Gwynns Falls area, with its steep wooded ravines and meandering stream and abundance of native flora and fauna, it stood as a natural counterbalance to the encroaching brick and mortar cityscape. So the 1901 designation, it can thus be understood not only as an early act of environmental conservation, but also as a precursor to the kind of urban park design that will define progressive American city planning in the decades to come. So 3 years after the Gwynns Falls Reserve was established, Baltimore commissioned a report from the Olmsted brothers, who were the successors to the renowned landscape architect known as Frederick Law Olmsted, who had designed Central Park in New York City. So the firm, led at the time by John Charles Olmsted and Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., these two up here. So they brought with it a revolutionary ideology rooted in the belief that natural landscapes should be preserved for both ecological function and public health. So in the 1904 plan, the Olmsted brothers they laid out a comprehensive vision for a series of interconnected green spaces that they termed as stream valley parks. And this concept it sought to preserve the natural drainage systems and the scenic corridors along Baltimore's major streams, particularly Herring Run, Jones Falls, and Gwynns Falls, from the threat of overdevelopment. So rather than simply having to build an isolated recreational grounds, the Olmsteads they envisioned a network of green belts that would simultaneously serve the practical needs of watershed protection and the spiritual, the physical, and emotional health of Baltimore's residents. So the Gwynns Falls Valley, it featured prominently in their plans, and the Olmsted report emphasized preserving the area's rolling hills, the woodlands, and the natural rock outcroppings as a kind of living museum of Maryland's pre-industrial landscape. So the brothers they believed that the parkland should maintain a naturalistic appearance, allowing the land's original ecological character to dictate design rather than imposing formal gardens or rigid symmetry. So this forward-thinking philosophy it influenced subsequent land acquisitions and will ultimately help shape the boundaries and the ethos of what will become Leakin Park. So by the mid 20th century, one of the most significant land parcels in the Gwynns Falls watershed, it belonged to the Crimea estate, a private secluded property that was once owned by Thomas Decay Winans from 1820 to 1878. So Winans, he was the son of Ross Winans, who's down here. So he was the son of Ross Winans, who was a prominent Baltimore inventor and locomotive builder who had amassed considerable wealth in the early 19th century through contracts with the Russian Empire to build railways and locomotives. And Thomas Decay Winans, he carried on his family's transatlantic legacy. And deeply influenced by his time in Russia, he named his sprawling estate Crimea after the Crimean Peninsula. And the estate occupied hundreds of acres of wooded highlands west of downtown Baltimore, and it included several notable structures. The most famous being the Orianda Mansion, which was a more majestic Italianate style villa that was built in the 1850s. So the Winans, so the family, they used the estate as a private retreat, complete with a carriage house, stables, gardens, and stone outbuildings. So the area, it remained isolated from the encroaching urbanization well into the 20th century, retaining its bucolic charm and European influence. However, though, by the 1940s, the property stood at a crossroads because the city of Baltimore, inspired by the Olmsted vision and motivated by increasing pressure to conserve open space, they made plans to acquire the Crimea estate for public use. And the acquisition was also made possible by a philanthropic bequest from James Wilson Leakin from 1852 to 1922. So James Wilson Leakin, he was a distinguished Baltimore lawyer. He was a civic leader and benefactor. He passed away 2 decades earlier, but his will included a provision for the creation of a park in memory of his grandfather, Mayor James Leakin, who actually served as Baltimore's mayor in the early 1800s. So J. Wilson Leakins, so his will stipulated that the park that it must bear the Leakin name as a condition for the funding to be released. And the city, which had by then taken serious interest in expanding its Stream Valley Park system, they leveraged this bequest to finance the acquisition of the Crimea estate from the remnants of the Winans family holdings. And the choice of land, it was deliberate. Not only was it geographically and ecologically consistent with the Gwynns Falls Reserve and the Olmsted recommendations, but it also contained enough historic, scenic, and cultural value to warrant permanent protection and memorialization. So by the late 1940s, the estate was officially incorporated into Baltimore's public park system. Thus, Leakin Park was born, named in honor of a family deeply tied to the city's legal and political history, and formed upon land once owned by a family with equally deep economic and transnational roots. So, with the integration of the Crimea estate into Leakin Park, the city not only acquired acres of pristine woodland, but they also inherited several significant architectural and historical features. So, the chief among them was the Orianda Mansion, which remains a standing monument to mid 19th century wealth and design. So, constructed in a style that merged Italian and Russian influences, the mansion features ornate woodwork, grand interior spaces, and an elevated sitting that commands sweeping views of the surrounding forest, which is adjacent. So, adjacent to the mansion are stone outbuildings. You have garden remnants and paths that reflect the estate's original function as both a residential and leisure retreat. And these structures, they were preserved as part of the park's historical narrative, with some efforts made in later decades to restore and adapt them for public use, including arts, programs, and educational research. And then we also have the significance. So, what is the historical significance of Leakin Park? So, when it comes to the historical identity of Leakin Park, so really it's deeply rooted in the 19th century legacy of the Crimea estate, an opulent and ambitious landholding developed by Thomas Decay Winans, who was an industrialist and engineer whose family fortune stemmed from the B&O Railroad and railway ventures in Imperial Russia. So in the 1850s, the Winans, they began acquiring vast tracts of land northwest of Baltimore City, eventually amassing more than 1,000 acres that would come to include what is now Leakin Park and surrounding woodlands. So his vision, it was both aesthetic and imperial, because he aimed to recreate the beauty and seclusion of European estates, particularly those, and once again, particularly those reminiscent of the Crimean Peninsula, which inspired the estate's name. So really, the Oriental Mansion. So this overall is, this architecture. This is basically, this mansion, this architecture is pretty much architecture of power, because really it's a striking example of the Italian and Gothic revival architecture. And this was completed around 1856. And this three-story stone manor with its Belvedere tower, its arched windows, and its decorative cornices, it was not just a family residence. It was a statement of wealth, taste, and cultivated identity. So Orianda, it served as the primary dwelling on the estate, and it remains the most architecturally dominant feature of the historic site. And today it stands as a protected Baltimore City landmark and a tangible symbol of the 19th century aristocratic ideals transplanted onto American soil. And the mansion's architectural details, it pretty much include a lot with it includes a lot with the marble fireplaces, the parquet flooring, the hand carved woodwork, and the ornamental plaster ceilings, and the layout and materials that reflect the European influence that Winans had absorbed during his years in Russia, where he oversaw the construction of the St. Petersburg Moscow Railway alongside his father, Ross Winans, who was a fellow industrial magnate. Now, not really far from the mansion, Winans, he commissioned a small Gothic style chapel, which remains another key feature in the park's historical fabric. And its lancet windows and pointed archways and buttressed facade evoke English ecclesiastical design. And once again, it reflects his penchant, Winans' penchant for European mimicry, cultural mimicry. Though smaller in scale, the chapel's spiritual and symbolic function, it cannot be overstated, because it was a space that was meant to convey permanence, legacy, and moral stewardship over the land. So additional estate structures included stables, greenhouses, and carriage houses, some of which were constructed with cut stone quarried locally, and again underscoring Winton's desire for durability and local integration. And though many of these have not survived, archaeologically and landscape remnants, they still mark their presence. And Winans, he also transformed the topography of the Crimea to match his romantic vision, because he rerouted streams, he carved out terraces, and he also laid footpaths and carriage roads, many of which will become foundational in the future park's trail system. So the estate, it was a controlled natural environment, engineered to evoke the sublime while remaining comfortably within the bounds of elite leisure. Ornamental plantings, imported trees, and manicured lawns, they were juxtaposed with wild forest and the Gwyn's Falls ravine, creating an experience of curated wilderness. And today, much of this landscape has grown wilder and less tamed. But traces of this intentional design, they remain, because historic stone bridges and retaining walls, some constructed by European artisans hired by Winans, they still stand, quietly asserting their place in Baltimore's cultural heritage. And then we'll talk about here the Expressway controversy, VOLPE, and the battle for Leakin Park. So by the early 1970s, nearly 120 years after the Winans' ambitious estate had reshaped the land, a new threat had emerged, and not really of imperial origin, but of federal infrastructure. So the proposed construction of the East-West Express, the East-West Express, I-70 North, through the heart of Leakin Park, represented one of the most contentious chapters in Baltimore's urban development history, and it became a watershed moment in the American urban environmental movement. So, as part of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, Baltimore was one of many cities slated for a web of interstate highways intended to modernize transportation, to reduce congestion, and connect the suburban periphery to downtown. And the proposed I-70 extension, it will cut directly through Leakin Park, effectively bisecting the forested valleys of Gwynns Falls and devastating ecosystems, recreational areas, and the historical integrity of the Crimea state. So the city planners initially perceived so what they initially perceived as necessary progress, it was met with fierce opposition from local residents, from environmentalists, historians, and even civic leaders who saw the project as an existential threat to West Baltimore's last intact forest. And the opposition, it also coalesced into a grassroots coalition named VOLPE. And VOLPE, this stands for Volunteers Opposed to the Leakin Park Expressway, which was a wry acronym mocking John A. Volpe, who was a then Secretary of Transportation under President Richard Nixon. So Volpe's activism was sophisticated and strategic because you had Members included architects, environmental scientists, landscape historians, legal experts, and community organizers who all issued reports. They also held town halls, and they also initiated litigation, and they leveraged the newly passed National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, which it required environmental impact statements for federally funded projects. So when it comes to the environmental and historical defense, so the group's case, it hinged on two major arguments. It hinged on the environmental impact and historical significance. So let's start with the environmental impact. So Leakin Park represented one of the largest remaining contiguous forest tracts in an urban environment along the eastern seaboard. So Volpe, they argued that the highway would disrupt watersheds, it would destroy animal habitats, and it would increase runoff pollution in Gwynns Falls, and it would create irreversible ecological fragmentation. And number two, you also had the historical significance because you had advocates that emphasized the cultural and historical value of the Crimea estate. In 1971, the Maryland Historical Trust was petitioned to document and landmark the Crimea structures, including the Oriana Mansion and Chapel, thereby invoking protections under local preservation ordinances and federal heritage statutes. So these dual arguments, the environmental and historical, they prove to be crucial in framing Leakin Park as not just green space, but as a vital heritage landscape. So by 1980, after nearly a decade of protests, of lawsuits, and shifting public opinion, the I-70 extension through Leakin Park was formally canceled. So it was one of the rare urban expressway proposals of the post-war to be halted after planning had already begun. So the victory of Volpe not only preserved the park, but it also symbolized a broader turning point in American urban planning, one that valued environmental preservation over infrastructural expansion. So Baltimore's political leadership, including Mayor William Donald Schaefer, eventually he came to side with the preservationists, further sealing the project's fate. So the segment of I-70 that had already been constructed was now truncated, and today it ends just short of the park, an urban artifact of what could have been. And we also have the environmental and recreational features of Leakin Park. So when it comes to the environmental and recreational features, so at the heart of Leakin Park's environmental value is its rich, old growth, deciduous forest, a rare feature in any metropolitan area. So the park's forest canopy is composed primarily of eastern hardwoods, which are white oak, red oak, tulip, uh, tulip poplar, beech, and hickory, some of which are believed to be over 150 years old. And these mature stands, particularly those undisturbed by 20th century development pressures, offer the crucial habitat for native wildlife species, including white-tailed deer, red foxes, barred owls, and a broad range of migratory songbirds that rely on the park during their seasonal routes along the Atlantic Flyway. So the forest floor, it teems with biodiversity, particularly in spring when wildflowers such as bloodroot, Virginia bluebells, and mayapple, they burst into bloom, signaling the park's role in preserving Maryland's native flora. And the preservation of these old growth sections is crucial for sequestering carbon, stabilizing soil, filtering rainwater, and serving as a living laboratory for ecological studies. And Leakin Park is also bisected by several tributaries, with the Gwen Falls stream acting as a vital artery within the park's ecosystem. So these waterways drain into the Baltimore Harbor and eventually into the Chesapeake Bay, placing Leakin Park within the larger Chesapeake Bay watershed, one of the most endangered estuarine systems in the world. And the park, it functions as a natural buffer against urban runoff, filtering pollutants before they even reach the bay, and the preservation of riparian buffers and wetlands in the park, it helps reduce erosion. It helps to reduce erosion, to restore native aquatic habitats, and mitigate flooding in nearby urban neighborhoods. And numerous environmental studies by the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, a long-term ecological research project, they have used Leakin Park as a key site to measure the interplay between urban development and forest health. And then when it comes to the recreational amenities, so we have athletic facilities and community recreation. So though Leakin Park, even though it's known primarily for its wilderness features, it is also home to a range of active recreational amenities that reflect Baltimore's mid 20th century efforts to improve public access to green space. You have tennis courts, you have basketball courts, and open play fields. They were also developed as part of a broader parks and recreation initiative beginning in the 1950s, particularly after the city annexed additional green space west of the Gwynns Falls. So these facilities, they were designed with community cohesion in mind. And during the 1960s and 1970s, they served as sites for neighborhood tournaments like school leagues, summer youth programs, and some of these fields, such as those near the Winnings Meadow area, they were constructed with WPA era labor and funding, connecting the park's infrastructure to broader federal efforts to stimulate employment and to build civic infrastructure during the Great Depression. And you also have the Gwynns Falls Trail. And the Gwynns Falls Trail, this is a 15-mile greenway running through the heart of Leakin Park. And it has become one of the most significant urban trails in the region. And it was developed in the early 2000s as part of the Baltimore Greenway Trails Network. And the trail, it follows the path of the historic Gwynns Falls waterway, and it provides a scenic route for pedestrians, for cyclists, and nature enthusiasts. And what makes the Gwynns Falls Trail exceptional is its role in linking uh, disparate communities from the dense urban core near Carroll Park and downtown Baltimore to the suburban and forested stretches near Dickeyville, which is a historic mill village that is adjacent to the park's northwestern boundary. And the trail, it features interpretive signage, pedestrian bridges, and restored stonework from 19th century water management infrastructure, marring history and recreation. So, moreover, the trail, it serves as a model of adaptive reuse, repurposing abandoned rail lines and unused right of ways into vital corridors of non motorized transportation, effectively connecting the parks and neighborhoods and educational institutions across the socioeconomic lines. And then you also have the different educational centers also within this area. So the first is you have the Kerry Murray Nature Center. So one of the most impactful features of Leakin Park is the Carrie Murray Nature Center, which was founded in 1985, and it was named after the mother of the famed Baltimore-born baseball Hall of Famer Eddie Murray. So this naming was not only a gesture of personal significance, but also a nod to the power of education and legacy within Baltimore's African American community. And located in the park's Winners Meadow area, the center functions as both a learning hub and a sanctuary for animal rehabilitation. And it also offers year round environmental education programming to Baltimore City public schools, emphasizing field based learning. And its curriculum includes watershed science, climate literacy, wildlife conservation, and urban ecology. And the center houses several live animals, including native raptors, reptiles, and amphibians, which were used for educational demonstrations. And its trails and sensory gardens and bird watching stations, it also allowed children and adults alike to engage directly with the landscape. And the center, it's also ADA accessible, reflecting a growing commitment to inclusive outdoor education. So over the years, the Carrie Murray Nature Center has hosted environmental summer camps, scout badge programs, and community service initiatives in collaboration with the with the Audubon Society and Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and its partnership with City's Department of Recreation and Parks. It further institutionalizes its role in shaping future generations of environmental stewards. And also, we have the Chesapeake Bay Outward Bound School. So, operating within Leakin Park's historic Orienta House campus, the Chesapeake Bay Outward Bound School, it brings a unique element of experiential education and youth development to the park. So, part of the International Outward Bound Network. So, this was established in Baltimore in the 1980s, and it began using Leakin Park as its operational base shortly after. So this school, it uses the park's rugged terrain, its forest trails, and high ropes courses to facilitate character building programs, particularly for underserved and at-risk youth from Baltimore's public schools. And these programs, they emphasize resilience, teamwork, and leadership, often pushing the students outside their comfort zones through hiking, expeditions, camping, and trust-based activities. And one of the key features of this school, of this approach, is its integration of social emotional learning with outdoor education. See, Leakin Park's relative isolation within the city, it allows for an immersive retreat-like experience without the cost or logistics of transporting students out of town. Moreover, it also had its programs because really the programs they often conclude with community service projects within the park, fostering a direct connection between personal growth and civic responsibility. And also, we have the challenges and the controversies of Leakin Park. Now its crime-ridden reputation, it has been etched into the collective consciousness of Baltimore residents and beyond, which is often referred to as the city's largest unregistered graveyard. And the park's vast secluded woods have historically provided a grim convenience to perpetrators seeking to hide the bodies of their victims. And since the 1940s, at least 75 human remains have been found within or in close proximity to the park. Although the real number it could be higher due to underreported or unsolved cases. So the sheer size and the dense forestry of Leakin Park, it plays a significant role in its reputation because the isolated pockets within the park, they offer cover away from the city streets and law enforcement surveillance, creating an environment that's ideal for the disposal of bodies or the committing of crimes without immediate detection. And the park's isolation is not accidental, but it was intentionally preserved as a wilderness retreat. Ironically, that very design now contributes to the sense of unease surrounding it. Now, residents have long expressed ambivalence about Leakin Park. For some people, it's a green haven that's used for hiking, for bird watching, and historical tours. But for other people, particularly in surrounding neighborhoods, historically plagued by systemic disinvestment, gun violence, and crime, the park evokes fear rather than recreation. So, despite the efforts in recent years to rebrand and reclaim the park through environmental education programs, community events, and enhanced police patrols, its association with violent crime, it retains stubbornly persistent. Even to this day, it still remains stubbornly persistent. So, I want to go over and name a few notable cases here that also had took place. The stories that cemented Leakin Park's infamy. And the first one I want to go into is so really the first one we want to go and talk about is overall it's the first one, which is Hyman Lee, 1999. So arguably the most well-known case tied to Leakin Park is the murder of Hyman Lee, who was an 18-year-old Woodlawn High School student who brought global attention to the park's dark history. So she disappeared on January 13th, 1999, and her partially buried body, it was discovered almost a month later on February 9th by a maintenance worker who noticed disturbed earth in a remote section of the park. And an autopsy revealed that she had been manually strangled. So her ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed, was arrested, tried, and convicted of her murder in 2000. However, though, so 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 however though well, so really he was receiving a life sentence plus 30 years. But however though, his case became a focal point of public controversy after it was examined in season 1 of the Serial podcast in 2014, which raised a lot of questions about the reliability of the prosecution's timeline and the effectiveness of Syed's legal representation and the evidence that was presented. So millions of listeners who were introduced to the geographical and cultural contours of Leakin Park through the podcast, associating it indelibly with the case. And in September 2022, his conviction was vacated and he was released after serving more than 2 decades. So, based on the discovery of previously suppressed evidence pointing to alternate suspects, however, the state later dropped the charges entirely. Despite this legal reversal, the initial discovery of Lee's body in Leakin Park remains a key piece of the case's narrative, and it reinforces the park's reputation as a site in where dark truths lie buried, literally and metaphorically. And also, perhaps one of the most horrifying chapters in the park's dark history occurred in April 1968, which was in the aftermath of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a period already marked by civil unrest and violence across Baltimore. So, Reginald Oates, and this is Reginald Oates right here. So, Reginald Oates, he was an 18-year-old African American man suffering from severe mental illness. He abducted 4 boys ranging in ages from 5 to 10, and he lured them into the wooded areas of Leakin Park, and he committed acts of unspeakable brutality. He sexually assaulted them and mutilated them before murdering them and concealing their bodies in remote areas of the park. And the crimes, they shocked the entire city, and even amid a volatile social and political climate. And Oates' actions, they stood out for their cruelty and their premeditation. At trial, he was found not guilty by treason, but by reason of insanity, and he was committed to a mental institution. So he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and he was declared incompetent to stand trial. And his case, now Reginald Oates, his case became emblematic of 2 social crises, and those 2 social crises were, number one, it was the fragility of urban mental health infrastructure. And number two, it was the vulnerability of children in inner city communities. So for many Baltimore residents, the Oates murders marked the beginning of Leakin Park's descent into infamy. And then there's also Raymond Hopewell from 1999 to 2005. Now, even though not all of Raymond Hopewell's crimes were directly committed within Leakin Park, the serial nature of his offenses and their proximity to the park added another dark layer to its reputation. So between 1999 and 2005, Hopewell terrorized the elderly community of Baltimore, particularly targeting women that were aged 60 and above. He would break into their homes, he would sexually assault them, and he would murder them, often through suffocation or blunt force trauma. And there were at least five murders that have been definitively attributed to him, though the investigators they suspected more. So Hopewell lived in West Baltimore and operated in areas bordering Leakin Park. And given the nature of his crimes and his knowledge of the terrain, authorities had fear the park may have served as a location for stalking or escape. And he was eventually arrested in 2005 and he was convicted based on DNA evidence. And his case is often cited by criminal profilers as a study in escalation from theft to rape to serial murder. Though not a Leakin Park killer in the strictest sense, Hopewell's connection to the surrounding to the surrounding geography it deepened the public's anxiety about the kinds of criminals operating in the park's orbit. And then you have Stephen Gillis in 2022. So the murder of Stephen Gillis in September 2022 it demonstrated that Leakin Park's association with violent crime is not confined to the distant past. So Gillis, he was a 39-year-old man from Anne Arundel County. He was abducted and later found dead in the trunk of a burning car, discovered within the park. And surveillance footage had revealed that he had been forcibly taken the night before. When firefighters responded to reports of a vehicle fire along one of the park's isolated roads, they uncovered the charred remains and autopsy had confirmed that Gillis that he had suffered blunt force trauma and likely died before the vehicle was set ablaze. So investigators suspect that the murder was related to an ongoing drug or gang related dispute, and no arrests were immediately made. In the case, it still remains under investigation. So this incident it starkly highlighted how despite community initiatives and public campaigns to sanitize its image, Lincoln Park still functions as a dumping ground for those wishing to erase the evidence of violence, the modernity of Gillis's murder, captured in part through digital surveillance and investigated using forensic technology, clashed with the primal brutality of the act itself, reinforcing the park's chilling legacy. And there were also other incidents that also happened here. Other people who were actually found in Leakin Park. Some found near Leakin Park as well too. And even though and even though it's not all of the victims, but I just want to name a few here just to give you, just to give you more proof on the many people overall, the victims that were found in Leakin Park and near the park. So we have Richard Wayne Truman. And Richard Wayne Truman, he was 13 years of age, and he was found on November 18th, 1946. And the circumstances of this was that he was shot accidentally during a hunting outing in the park by a 15-year-old friend of his named Robert Clayton Wright. And his decomposed body, it was discovered under under honeysuckle. And Wright, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter. And then we have Eugene Leroy Anderson, who was age 20. He was found on October 27th, 1969. And the background behind this is that a member of the Black Panther Party. So his body was found clothed in the park. And some suspect that there was some internal Black Panther involvement in this. And other people also point to the possible FBI covert interference. And we also have Luther Wagner, age 21, and he was found on December 2nd, 1974, near Franklin Town Road. And the perpetrator who committed this crime was Fred T. Sampson. And we also have Wanda Carter, age 22, found on December 7th, 1976, on Windsor Mill Road. And the perpetrator was Olivia L. Tatum. And we also have Margaret L. Robinson, age 19, found on June 26, 1981, And the perpetrator who committed this crime, who committed this crime, was her husband. And we also have Joyce Ann DeShields, age 26, found on May 9th, 1982. And in the notes, it says that she was killed by a suspected serial killer who remained at large at this time. And then we also have Oliver Wendell Munson, age 39. He went missing on February 13th, 1984. And the circumstances is that he was a middle school teacher, and his car and receipts they were found near the park, and he was believed to be murdered and possibly buried there. And Dennis Watson, he was a person of interest. And then we have Vashawn Kamal Conyers, age 30, found on January 2018. And the details, they discovered charred in a well near Franklin Town Road. And overall, Leakin Park, it has claimed dozens more victims over the years. And once again, the estimates, estimates exceed 70 bodies since the 1940s. And many investigations recovered the remains in 2018, as well as many unsolved homicide cases. And some known victims like Alfred Washington, William Braxton, William Emerson Dorsey, Paul John Casper, or Milton Beatty lack detailed public data. But overall, Leakin Park's nickname, it holds chilling truth. The wooded seclusion has made it a long-term dumping ground, and the cases, they all range wildly from accidental deaths to serial killings, domestic homicides, plus politically sensitive incidents, and many cases remain unsolved, and some victims unidentified or only sporadically documented. And ongoing efforts by authorities, volunteers, and true crime researchers, they strive to shed light on these tragedies. So really the identity of Leakin Parks, it exists in a state of contradiction because on one hand, it is a historic and ecological gem, home to old growth forest, historic carriage trails, and diverse wildlife. But on the other hand, it's a symbol of urban decay, systemic violence, and tragic loss. The park's criminal legacy, especially the notable cases of Hyman Lee, the Reginald Oates victims, and others, has cemented its place in America's macabre folklore. Pop culture, journalism, and true crime media have only amplified this image. Yet the park is not just a place of death, because community groups like the Friends of Gwynns Falls, Leakin Park, alongside city agencies, they continue working to restore its reputation through environmental education, volunteer patrols, and engagement with local schools. Still, the shadow of its violent history, it remains heavy for every wildflower planted, and there's a body remembered. For every trail cleared, there's a story that refuses to disappear. So Leakin Park's dense foliage and secluded areas have made it a convenient location for disposing of bodies. And many of the victims found in the park, they were killed elsewhere and they were brought there post-mortem. And this has led to a pervasive fear among the local residents and visitors. And once again, there have been many efforts that have been made to rehabilitate the park's image and to enhance safety because you have community members and local officials that have advocated for increased patrols and maintenance. Because in 2011, some secluded areas they were closed off to deter illicit activities. But despite these efforts, incidents like the 2023 assault, for example, of a 71-year-old woman during a walk in the park highlight ongoing safety concerns. And in 2013, plans by Baltimore Gas and Electric to install a new natural gas pipeline through the park, it also sparked environmental concerns. And after negotiations and public input, an alternative route was chosen to minimize the ecological damage, though some tree loss was unavoidable. And the Friends of Gwynns Falls, Leakin Park, established in 1983. It also plays a pivotal role in the park advocacy, organizing cleanups and educational programs and preservation efforts. And recent initiatives, they aim to designate the park as Baltimore's first state park, enhancing funding and management resources. But overall, Leakin Park, it stands as a testament to Baltimore's commitment to preserving natural spaces within an urban environment. And despite the challenges, the ongoing community efforts, they still continue to enhance and protect this vital green space for future generations.